You didn't ask for help, not because you didn't need it, but because somewhere along the way, you learned that needing help was the same thing as being weak. You figured things out alone. You got quiet when things got hard. And when someone asked if you were okay, you said, "Fine," before they even finished the sentence. If that hit somewhere deep, stay with me. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a description of a generation. It's the story of why so many of you carry invisible weight that no one ever taught you to put down. Picture this. It's a Tuesday afternoon in 1979. A 10-year-old comes home from school, unlocks the front door with the key hanging around their neck, and walks into an empty house. No parent waiting, no snack on the table, just the hum of the refrigerator and a note that says, "Dinner's in the freezer." Lock the door. So the kid does what they always do. They handle it. They heat up the food. They do the homework. They watch TV until a parent comes home, tired and distracted. And no one asks how the day was. So the kid stops expecting anyone to. That child grew up to become what we now call Generation X. Born between 1965 and 1980. Sandwiched between the loud idealism of baby boomers and the vocal emotional fluency of millennials. Often called the forgotten generation. The middle child of history. But here's what nobody talks about. The psychology that formed inside that quiet house. Inside that silence. Inside that "I'll handle it myself" moment that repeated itself 10,000 times before they turned 18. Psychologists have a term for what happened to a lot of Gen X kids. It's called parentification. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies. The quiet kind. The subtle kind, where a child absorbs adult stress without anyone meaning for it to happen. Their parents, many of them baby boomers, were busy rewriting the rules of society. They were divorcing in record numbers, working longer hours, discovering themselves. It wasn't malice. It was simply the era. But children aren't wired to understand eras. They're wired to feel presence and absence. And when presence is inconsistent, a child's nervous system makes a decision. A very logical, very human decision. I will become someone who doesn't need too much. That's not cynicism. That's adaptation. That's a child doing the most intelligent thing they know how to do. Make themselves manageable so the people they love don't feel burdened. And they were incredibly good at it. Gen X became the most self-sufficient generation in modern history. They didn't have helicopter parents hovering over every scraped knee. They rode bikes until dark. They solved problems without Google, without life coaches, without therapy apps. They figured it out. But here's the thing about emotional armor. It works until it doesn't. Because the same system that protected you as a child, the one that said, "Don't ask for too much, don't feel too loudly, just get on with it," that same system follows you into your marriage, into your parenting, into your friendships, into the quiet 2 a.m. moments when the armor gets heavy and you don't know why you feel so alone in a life that, by all appearances, looks completely fine. This is the hidden wound of Gen X. Not dramatic trauma, not obvious neglect, just a slow, steady message, absorbed over years. Your emotions are not the priority. Pause for a moment and think about that. How many times have you dismissed your own feelings before anyone else had the chance to? How many times have you said, "I'm fine," and meant, "I'm exhausted, but I don't know how to let anyone see that"? There's a reason Gen X became fluent in irony and sarcasm. Psychologists say that dark humor and emotional detachment are often protective mechanisms. They're ways of saying something true without becoming vulnerable to it. If you can laugh at how bad things are, no one can use your pain against you. If you stay slightly removed, slightly above it all, you maintain control. Gen X watched institutions fail them in real time. They saw Watergate unravel. They watched the AIDS crisis get ignored. They saw the economy collapse in the early 1980s. They were told you could be anything you want, while the floor beneath that promise quietly cracked. So they stopped trusting the promise. They started trusting themselves. And they built a worldview around one unspoken rule. Expect less, so you're never blindsided. That's not pessimism. That's the philosophical response of people who were promised a safety net and learned, very early, that they were the safety net. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Here's the part that most conversations about Gen X completely miss. For all the self-reliance, for all the emotional stoicism, for all the whatever energy that became their cultural signature, Gen X is one of the most deeply loyal generations alive. When they love you, they show up. Quietly, practically, without fanfare. They don't send long emotional texts. They fix your car. They show up at 11 p.m. when you call. They remember what you said 6 months ago that you thought no one was listening to. They carry people, because the other side of learning to need nothing is learning to give everything. And nobody talks about that. The same child who learned to be invisible became the adult who makes sure no one in their circle ever feels invisible. The emotional language wasn't lost. It was just translated into action, into loyalty, into showing up when it matters. But there's a cost. There's always a cost. The adult who gives everything without asking for anything back eventually reaches a wall. It doesn't look like a breakdown. It looks like exhaustion, like emotional numbness, like waking up and feeling nothing in particular, like going through the motions of a life that looks impressive from the outside and feels hollow from the inside. Psychologists call it compassion fatigue or emotional burnout. But for Gen X, it often goes undiagnosed because they've spent their whole lives treating their own needs as optional. They're now in their 40s and 50s, many of them sandwiched between aging parents who need care and their own kids who need guidance. Still holding everything, still not asking for help, still the most self-sufficient person in every room they walk into. And somewhere underneath all of that competence is that 10-year-old, standing in an empty house, heating up their own dinner, waiting for someone to notice they were doing an extraordinary thing just by surviving quietly. Here's the realization I want you to sit with. The traits that made Gen X resilient, the independence, the skepticism, the ability to function without external validation. Those aren't flaws. But they were never meant to be permanent solutions. They were emergency responses. Brilliant, adaptive ones. But emergency responses don't make good permanent identities. The question isn't whether Gen X is strong. Obviously they are. The question is, what would it mean to let some of that strength rest? What would happen if the person who always handles it actually said, I don't want to handle this alone today? For many in this generation, that sentence feels more frightening than any actual danger ever did. Because vulnerability was never safe. And somewhere in the nervous system, it still isn't. But here's what the research actually tells us. What neuroscience and psychology keep confirming year after year. The capacity for connection, real, deep, unguarded connection, doesn't disappear just because it was suppressed early. It waits. It stays. It taps lightly on the inside of your chest at odd moments. During a song, during a drive, during a quiet evening that should feel peaceful, but instead feels like something is missing. That ache isn't weakness. That's the part of you that survived everything, reminding you that it's still here, that it still wants something more than just coping. Gen X inherited a world in transition and carried it without complaining. They became the quiet backbone of modern culture, of workplaces, of families. They adapted to more change in less time than almost any generation before them. Analog to digital, Cold War to the internet, skepticism to improvisation. They didn't get participation trophies. They didn't get validation. A lot of them didn't even get enough attention. But they got something else. They got themselves. And that self, resilient, perceptive, sardonic, deeply loyal, quietly strong, is one of the most underestimated psychological profiles of our time. So if you're Gen X, or you love someone who is, understand this. The distance isn't indifference. The silence isn't coldness. The self-sufficiency isn't arrogance. It's a language, learned young, spoken fluently, by someone who needed to translate "I cared deeply" into something that felt safe enough to actually do. The deepest act of understanding you can offer a Gen X person isn't to praise their strength. It's to make it safe, even for just a moment, for them to not have to use it. And if you are that person, standing in your own metaphorical empty house, key around your neck, handling everything with quiet precision, this is for you specifically. You were never meant to need nothing. You were just taught to pretend. And there's a difference. There always was.